This webinar is to introduce you to a plant health site-specific risk assessment. Please note that this webinar is for guidance only and is written for horticulturists in Wales. Information relates to Great Britain, but other countries will have different lists and risks. So the key topics we will cover on the plant health risk assessment and how to start one for your nursery will be what are risk assessments for, what makes up a site-specific risk assessment for plant health, how to identify the main pathways for pests and pathogens onto a site, and how to fill in a risk assessment and assign risk levels to pests and pathogens. Your risk assessment will be built up in stages and they'll follow the sequence of activities shown in this flow diagram. So firstly, you'll need to identify the boundaries of your site, then list the operations that take place on the site, list the plants that you use and the plant material, list possible pathogens, pests and host plants, then map the pest and pathogen pathways, identify control measures, and then fill in a site-specific risk assessment table. And then when you've done that, implement control measures and of course monitor how successful those control measures are and whether any new risks arise or not. So to begin with, what is a risk assessment? Risk assessment is a process in which you identify the hazards in your business. For each of those risks, you assign levels to each of the hazards based on the impact of the business, so that's the impact, and then the likelihood of it occurring, so impact and likelihood. And that's often on a 5-point scale of 1 to 5. So 1 is minor and 5 is major. Now that's called unmitigated risk. Then you decide on what actions you can take to reduce the levels of risk. And the level of risk you assess after you've taken the action is known as the mitigated risk. So those actions relate to your business and you're best placed to know what those are. There are certain actions that you do have to take to meet your statutory obligations. Now, a risk assessment is based on a matrix or a table. So the risk assessment form will look a bit like the top row we have there. So the name of the risk, the description of the risk, scale of impact, scale of likelihood, the level of unmitigated risk, the actions you take to mitigate, and then after you've done those, what would be the scale of the mitigated impact and the likelihood of the mitigated, and then overall the level of the mitigated risk. So to find that level of risk in the end, unmitigated or mitigated, by using the scales of impact and likelihood, you often use a matrix, and we put the matrix there. So you can see the columns relate to the impact from insignificant to severe, and the rows are the likelihood. So if you have a minor impact but a very likely for the likelihood, you can see there that it gives you a level of mitigated risk or unmitigated risk, depending on which one you're doing, of high. So a minor impact paired with very likelihood gives you high. To give you another example, a major impact but very unlikely to occur gives you, coloured in yellow there, a medium level of risk. So that's a very useful table for investigating the level of risk, whether it's the unmitigated one or the mitigated one. So the first thing we need to know is, while we're listing the host plants and the major pests and pathogens is what actually are pathogens and pests. So a pathogen is an organism that causes disease in plants. It could be fungi or water moles, could be bacteria, viruses or mycoplasmas. And the pathogen is usually called by its Latin name. So for example here, Phytophthora infestans. A disease is the collection of symptoms that are caused by a pathogen. So that disease is usually given a common name, a descriptive name, for example, late blighted potato. And that's, as this example, the disease caused by the pathogen Phytophthora infestans. So that's pathogens and diseases. A pest is an animal that causes damage to plants. For example, an insect, or a rodent, or a nematode. A host plant is a species or a variety that can be infected by the pathogen or eaten by the pest. It's probably worth noting here that sometimes, particularly in government documents, that pests and pathogens are both called pests. So, firstly, list those plant species that you trade with. The ones that have the highest volumes, so the ones that you use most, or those that are large plants, those present the greatest risk. You should also note those for which there are statutory controls which relate to import and export. So all plants for planting require phytosanitary certificates and pre-notification for cross-border trade. Plant passports are needed for most trade within Great Britain. Also remember the pest-free areas in Great Britain, which are put in place to keep certain pests and diseases out of those places. So you have to be extra careful with those. So you've listed the host plants that you've got. Now you want to list the pests and pathogens that may affect them. You'll probably be aware of those that you already need to control on the nursery, so begin by listing those. For other potential problems, you can use a spreadsheet which is called the Pest and Disease Index. And you can download that from the UK Plant Health Information Portal. Now that spreadsheet lists the host plant species along with their common name and lists those against the pests and pathogens. So you can pick out pests and pathogens that are problems on your host plant species. It also says whether those pests and pathogens are present in the UK. Now, helpfully, that index also gives the unmitigated and the mitigated risks of each potential pest or pathogen. So you can use those figures directly in your risk assessment. It also gives you the possible pathways for it to enter the country and your site. So quite a lot of information in the Pest and Disease Index that helps you fill in your risk assessment. You can also get more details on the risks from the UK Plant Health Risk Register, which gives you much more information on individual pests and diseases that are potential problems. And it describes the mitigation measures that may be useful to you. So a very useful website to use. The Pest and Disease Index spreadsheet also has pages for quarantine pests and regulated non-quarantine pests. So it's useful to know what those mean. A quarantine pest is a pest or pathogen that's not present in Great Britain or not widely distributed, and is subject to statutory controls such as import controls and measures being put in place if they're found in Great Britain. Sometimes they're called notifiable pests. A regulated non-quarantine pest is a pest that may be in Great Britain, but whose presence may affect plants for planting with an unacceptable economic impact. A level of infection may be tolerated for those, but effective measures against them are available. In most cases, they're included in legislation and they're sometimes called non-notifiable pests. So the next step in our sequence is identifying pathways of pests and pathogens. Now you may want to list these, or you may want to actually draw them onto maps of your site, because that helps you visualize what's happening. So the pests and pathogens can arrive on your premises and then spread within it along what are called pest pathways. Some examples of how pests and pathogens may arrive at your site are visitors' shoes and clothes, machinery, imported or bought-in plants, soils and growing media, whether that's attached to the plant or whether it's been bought in, fruit and veg, cut flowers, foliage and branches, wood and wood products and other products made from plants, including pallets and bark mulch. But the pests and pathogens can also arrive through natural spread, which might be on the wind, or aerosols, water aerosols that are airborne, or in watercourses. Now you've collected most of the information that you need to put into your site-specific plant health risk assessment. And as we mentioned before, that risk assessment will take the form of a table. And the suggested columns here, although of course you can modify this, are the name of the plant, the name of the notifiable or site-specific pests or diseases, the pest pathway, the unmitigated risk rating, the mitigation measure, so that's often a control measure, then the risk rating after you've taken that mitigation measure, then the action, and it's important to put in by whom and by when to make sure that that's. Examples of those control or mitigation measures may be IPDM programs, having quarantine areas to set aside new arrived plants away from the others, making sure that you've got hygiene measures on site. Now, an example of that very simply would be disinfecting secateurs between pruning different plants. You might decide just not to import high-risk plants because the risk is too high to your nursery. Another example of mitigation measure would be treating irrigation water before it's used on plants. So you've now filled in that table and you've got an unmitigated risk rating. So that shows you where the most urgent actions are, and you need to carry those out to protect your business. You've also got the mitigated risk rating, which shows you what the risks are when you've taken that action to control the introduction of the problem or to control the spread of it on the nursery. Now that mitigated risk rating should be a considerably reduced risk. But if it's still high and shows that your revenue could be affected or your reputation as a supplier of high quality plants, then think again about trading in those host plants. Deciding what you do will depend on your site and your business type, and so you're best placed to know what to do. But your APHA, Plant Health Inspector, is also available to give you advice. So that's taken you through the process, guiding you as to how you may want to do a risk assessment, and there are modifications that you personally may want to make to that. But there are many benefits to putting the time into having your own pest and disease site-specific risk assessment, specific to your site. These include planning your biosecurity measures, planning your hygiene routines and training your staff in those, making sure that responsibilities on the nursery for plant health have been allocated to individuals, and making sure that you've documented your control measures, and then you can see what you do in successive years and have notes on whether the controls have been successful or unsuccessful, and then you can modify them. Now, this isn't the end of your risk assessment. You really need to update it periodically, particularly when new information becomes available, and that might be noticed on the Pest and Disease Index or the Plant Health Risk Register. You'll also need to monitor the effectiveness of the mitigation measures you're using and adjust those if you don't think they're being effective enough. Or you may want to introduce new ones when control measures become available. So I hope that gives you an introduction to site-specific risk assessments, and you'll want to learn more about it and produce one for your site. Thank you for listening.